I'm Patrick Saylor. I'm the Director of Marketing and Public Relations for the American Civil War Museum. Thank you so much for coming to our program today. It's always gratifying to see a nice crowd who is eager to learn and get a lot of knowledge. During my career, I have found that there are certain people that you can rely on for information about various things. And when it comes to Civil War maritime history, I think that person in my book would be Sam Craighead. Sam is our public relations manager. He has been a volunteer. Well, he's been at the museum for 20 years, 10 years as a volunteer, and then in January he'll celebrate his 10th anniversary as a full-time employee, and we're certainly glad to have him and blessed to. He's got a really good presentation for you on the Shenandoah. 2 weeks ago, it celebrated the 150th anniversary of the striking of its flag and its surrender, really marking the formal end of the Civil War. So without further ado, I will let Sam go, and thank you very much.
On February 21st, 1861, President Jefferson Davis appointed the former chairman of the United States Senate's Naval Affairs Committee as Secretary of the Navy for the new Confederate nation. Upon taking office, Stephen Russell Mallory knew he had a navy to create where none existed. On April 1st, Mallory sent President Davis a report stating, among other recommendations, I propose to adopt a class of vessels hitherto unknown to naval service, vessels built exclusively for ocean speed at low cost, with a battery of 1 or 2 accurate guns of long range, with an ability to keep the sea upon a long cruise and to engage or to avoid an enemy at will. On May 8th, former U.S. naval officer James Dunwoody Bullock, the man on your right, also, incidentally, the uncle of Teddy Roosevelt, was escorted into Mallory's office in Montgomery, Alabama. Mr. Mallory was a busy man at that time, and so were all the members of that hastily constructed provisional government. No useless phrases were employed in the presentation. Mr. Secretary, here's Captain Bullock, to which Mr. Mallory responded, I am glad to see you. I want you to go to Europe. When can you start? I have no impediments and can start as soon as you explain what I am to do. Mallory discussed with Bullock the woeful state of the Confederate Navy. Cruisers were required to launch against the merchant fleet of the United States, and ironclad warships were needed to be bought or built for breaking the blockade of the Confederate coast, which had been declared by the Lincoln government on April 19th. The two men reviewed the specifics of the types of ships to be acquired in Europe. By the following evening, Bullock was in transit by way of Canada to Liverpool. Under the stated basis for the blockade, established by the law of nations, Britain recognized the two sides involved in the conflict as belligerents on May 6th. Queen Victoria issued a proclamation of neutrality on the 13th of May. A belligerent is a nation or large section of a nation at war, in which the inhabitants have formed a regular government and thereby rule over their entire claimed territory. The soldiers serving in its army, when captured, should not be treated as rebels guilty of treason, but as prisoners of war, and its sailors and marines should not be treated as pirates. Other nations were to follow Britain's lead. Recognized as a belligerent, the Confederate States were granted the same consideration in the world as the United States. They could trade with neutrals not only in general merchandise and raw materials, but also in arms, ammunition, and materials of war. Bullock reached Liverpool on June 4th. Upon arrival, he went to the offices of Fraser Trenham and Company, which would be financing his operations. Using the company resources, Bullock was to buy arms and equipment as well as construct and purchase ships. One of the major challenges Bullock would have to surmount was the May 6, 1861 reissue of the British Foreign Enlistment Act. The Foreign Enlistment Act had become law on July 3, 1819. It was entitled An Act to Prevent the Enlisting or Engagement of His Majesty's Subjects to Serve in Foreign Service, and the fitting out or equipping in His Majesty's dominions vessels for warlike purposes without His Majesty's license. A violation was punishable as a misdemeanor, and the offender would be subject to a fine or imprisonment. The Foreign Enlistment Act had never been used to seize a vessel being built in a British shipyard, so no legal precedent existed to be referenced for interpretation. Bullock would be compelled to walk the fine line of the law if he were to acquire ships and naval supplies without hindrance as long as the war lasted. He consulted with one of Liverpool's leading solicitors, Mr. Frederick S. Hull, who found the act separated the building of a ship from the arming or equipping of a ship. Hull was to consult with two colleagues and proffer Bullock the following advice. Any shipbuilder may build any ship in Her Majesty's dominions, provided he does not equip her within Her Majesty's dominions, and he has nothing to do with the acts of the purchasers done within Her Majesty's dominions without his consent, nor outside Her Majesty's dominions even with his concurrence. Commander Bullock scrupulously was to follow these points. In all contracts in England, every possible precaution was practiced, both for the protection of the builders against criminal prosecution under the Act and for that of the ships against forfeiture. In no case was any builder or vendor informed what was the purpose of the purchaser. No ship was ever supplied with any portion of her equipment within Her Majesty's dominion, nor was the builder or vendor of any ship employed to assist in the equipment outside Her Majesty's dominions. Bullock was able to secure the construction of the raiders Florida and Alabama in Liverpool and across the Mersey River in Birkenhead, respectively. Over the next 3 years, these vessels, with the assistance of raiders Sumter, Tallahassee, Georgia, Clarence, Tacony, and Tuscaloosa, would destroy nearly 200 Union merchant and whaling ships, as well as one federal warship. Insurers increased their rates, and shippers became reluctant to use American bottoms. As a result, American owners sold their ships to foreign firms or individuals. 715 were sold to British interests. Bullock's next acquisition was Alexandra. He had contracted for her with the builder of Florida. She was nearly completed when, owing to increased pressure on the British government by the American minister, Charles Francis Adams, and his government, Alexandra was seized on the 6th of April, 1863, as having violated the Foreign Enlistment Act. The trial commenced on the 22nd of June and lasted 3 days. A verdict in Bullock's favor finally was handed down on the 11th of January, 1864. But he knew the possibility had been hampered severely of having ships constructed and sent to sea. On May 13th of that year, Commander Bullock wrote Mallory, "I have learned from all our officers commanding ships afloat that the United States flag had disappeared from the open sea, except perhaps in the whaling ground in the far-off North Pacific." On June 19th, Alabama was sunk off the coast of France by the U.S. warship Kearsarge. Florida was captured in the port of Bahia, Brazil on October 7 by USS Wachusett. Based upon Bullock's letter, Mallory consulted with advisors Commander John Mercer Brooke and Lieutenant Robert Randolph Carter about possible future commerce raiding operations. Both had seen the whaling fleet in the North Pacific in pre-war days while serving on USS Vincennes, flagship of the U.S. North Pacific Surveying and Exploring Expedition to Japan, the North Pacific, and the Arctic. Mallory sent a message requesting that Bullock acquire more vessels appropriately constructed, such as clippers, to invade the grounds of the whalers. The enemy's distant whaling grounds have not been visited by us. His commerce constitutes one of his reliable sources of national wealth, and no less than one of his best schools for seamen, and we must strike it if possible. A blow at the whaleman is a blow at New England exclusively, and by keeping in distant seas where steamers rarely go and coal is unattainable, they might make a successful cruise. He enclosed a memo from Brooke for guidance, dated August 19, 1864. A fast vessel with auxiliary steam power, leaving the meridian of the Cape of Good Hope on the 1st January, would reach Sydney in Australia in 40 days, adding 20 days for incidental interruptions, and leaving the coast of Australia on the 1st of March, passing through the whaling ground between New Zealand and New Holland. New Holland is an old name for Australia. And the Caroline Group, touching at Ascension and allowing 30 days for incidental interruptions, would reach the Ladrone Islands by the 1st of June. The Ladrone Islands include such islands as Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. She would then, visiting the Bulan Islands, one of which is Iwo Jima, Sea of Japan, Okhotsk, and North Pacific, be in position about the 15th of September north of the island of Oahu, distant from 60 to 100 miles, to intercept the North Pacific whaling fleet bound to Oahu with the products of the summer cruise. Bullock already had a ship in mind. Her name was Sea King. She was designed by the renowned naval architect William Rennie and built for Robertson and Company in Glasgow by Alexander Steam Firm in their yard at Kelvin Hall. The cost was 28,475 pounds. Robertson wanted the fastest ship that can be got and to have auxiliary power for the China trade to bring back the first of the season's tea to London. The plan bears the date 6 November 1862. The builder began laying down the lines in the mold loft 15 days later. Sea King was teak planked, 220 feet long, with a 32-foot 5-inch beam and a depth of hold 20 feet 5 inches. She possessed a telescoping stack which would help alter her appearance in her new occupation. When under sail, her propeller could be hoisted to reduce drag. On her trial in the Firth of Clyde, her speed was 11.07 knots over the measured mile. In acquiring Sea King, Commander Bullock employed an intermediary, Richard Wright, the father-in-law of Charles Prelo, managing partner of Fraser Treneman Company. And they acted as broker and financial agent for the Confederacy. On September 16th, Bullock sent a letter to Mallory informing him of the purchase. I have now the satisfaction to inform you of the purchase of a fine composite ship built for the Bombay trade and just returned from her first voyage. You will be gratified to learn this good fortune in finding a ship so admirably suited to our purpose, and I will only now assure you that no effort will be spared and no precaution neglected which may tend to get her speedily under our flag. Mr. Wright had Sea King cleared at the port of London for a voyage to carry coal to Bombay. Bullock hired Captain Peter Souther Corbett, who was authorized upon registration of the ship in London to sell the ship at any port out of the United Kingdom for not less than 45,000 pounds within 6 months from date of certificate. Commodore Samuel Barron, commander of Confederate European naval personnel, assigned a former U.S. Navy officer, Lieutenant James Ardell Waddell, to command the Rager. At age 41, standing 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighing 200 pounds, this was Waddell's first ship command. Most of his officers were half his age. A clandestine meeting between Wright and the new ship's executive officer, William Conway Whittle, took place at Whittle's London Hotel. Whittle would sail on Sea King to assess her qualities and plan for the needed alterations to transform her into a ship of war. With Whittle boarding the ship on October 8th, Sea King sailed for Madeira. Bullock purchased the steamer Laurel and loaded her with supplies. The Bill of Entry Office certificate said that the bills of lading for Laurel contained such items as tea, soap, 800 pairs of boots, along with 8 tons gun carriages, 18 tons iron shot, 2 cases and 60 barrels of ammunition, and 10 tons machinery. She was to proceed to Madeira to meet Sea King. All of the future Raiders officers, with the exception of her executive officer, were aboard Laurel. Meeting Sea King at the roads at Funchal, they were to proceed to a more hidden rendezvous for transfer of the officers and ship's contents. A voyage to Nassau was advertised for anyone wishing to take passage. Other interested inquiries were met with the news that all of the places were filled. Each officer received a receipt for his passage under an assumed name. This is an actual receipt and is part of our collection here at the museum. Laurel was registered in Glasgow, had 40 in her crew, and was under the command of James Francis Ramsay, an English licensed master. Formerly in the British East India Service, he had been appointed a lieutenant in the Confederate Navy in 1863. Cleared at Liverpool on October 8, 1864 for Matamoros by way of Havana and Nassau, Laurel arrived at Funchal prior to Sea King. Sea King appeared outside the harbor of Funchal on the 18th of October. Laurel set sail and the two ships proceeded to the island of Las Desertas, where the supplies, guns, and ammunition were transferred. The armament consisted of two 32-pounder Whitworth rifles and four 68-pounder smoothbore guns. She also carried two 12-pounder signal guns, which had been on her as a merchant ship, and those guns are now at the Naval Academy Museum. On the 19th of October, 1864, Sea King was commissioned CSS Shenandoah. Owing to some seamen being unwilling to sign on for a raider cruise, and short of crew, Shenandoah commenced her voyage. Sailing south, the cruiser took her first 7 prizes during the next 1.5 months. On December 4th, she found the whaling bark Edward of New Bedford, trying out a whale which was lashed to her side. Edward, at 274 tons, had sailed from New Bedford on August 2, 1864, and the captain decided to try his luck in the old grounds near the island of Tristan da Cunha. A prize crew was sent to the bark in one of the boats, and the whaler's master, Charles P. Worth, and his first mate, William A. Moser, were brought aboard the cruiser where a prize court was held. At a valuation of $20,000, the bark was condemned. Delighted the whaler was so well provisioned, the Confederates were able to stock up on food, rope, sail, and winter clothing, which Waddell was certain the crew would need in the future. The Confederates also placed 2 of the 5 whale boats on Shenandoah's davits and took the other 3 under tow. In addition to Captain Worth and his 3 mates, there were 22 crewmen taken as prisoners. Waddell selected Tristan da Cunha to land his prisoners. Upon entering Falmouth Bay, which was on the northwest side of the island, the prisoners were loaded into the 3 boats from Edward, and they pulled to shore. The following day, December 8th, the engineer discovered the brass coupling band on the propeller was broken. The top of the house was removed, and the crew hoisted up the propeller. With the propeller partially repaired by the next day, Shenandoah headed for Melbourne, Australia, where proper repairs could be made. Being a prime location for whalers and capturing and burning another merchantman on the way, the cruiser headed for Australia's Cape Lewin. The captain, desiring to be in Melbourne before the mail packet RMS Bombay departed on January 26, the cruiser made for Port Phillip. She was reported from Queenscliff on Wednesday, 25 January, to have gone up the West Channel at 5 p.m. At 6:45, let go the starboard anchor off Sandridge, veering to 45 fathoms. Waddell sent a message to the colonial governor, Charles Darling, notifying him the ship had arrived, and adding that the ship's machinery requires repairs, and I am in want of coal. I desire your excellency to grant permission that I may make the necessary repairs and supply of coal to enable me to get to sea as quickly as possible. The governor directed the Commissioner of Trade and Customs to request the captain of Shenandoah inform as to the nature and extent of the repairs and supplies required, so as to better judge the time required for the ship to remain in Melbourne. A diver employed by Langland Brothers and Company reported the ship's necessity to be placed in the government's slip. The slip was under lease to Mr. Enoch Chambers and not under the government's control. Repair, including the time to get her into the slip, would encompass approximately 10 days. This was duly reported to the governor. On February 9th, the newspaper Argus reported the Confederate ship Shenandoah was taken in tow early yesterday morning by the steam tug Black Eagle and placed between the piers of the patent slip Williamstown. During the afternoon, she was placed on the cradle, but the tide receding, she was not pulled up as far as required, which, however, will be accomplished at high water. During their stay in Melbourne, the officers were given free rail passes, allowing them to travel where they wished when off the ship. The crew was granted liberty. Some deserted with the connivance of the American consul, William Blanchard, who offered them lodging and supplemental pay. Her repairs completed on February 15th, the cruiser was hauled off the repair slip by a steamer and towed into the bay. On the 16th, she took on 250 tons of coal from the ship John Fraser, newly arrived from Liverpool. On the 17th, she reloaded from lighters her equipment and gear, which had been offloaded prior to her entry into the dry dock. With steam up at 7 a.m. on Saturday, February 18, 1865, Shenandoah took on the same pilot, Mr. William N. Nicholson, who had brought her into Port Phillip and put to sea. Amid rumors of her presence in almost every ocean, Shenandoah sailed into the Pacific in search of prey. Waddell headed for the whaling ground around New Zealand. Finding no Yankee ships, the sailors spent seemingly endless days and nights in monotonous search of a prize. On Wednesday, March 29th, Shenandoah came alongside the first ship she had boarded since taking the merchant ship Delphine near St. Paul's Island on her way to Australia. This ship was Pelham, properly registered to her Hawaiian owners after being sold by her Northern American owners. One of Pelham's officers reported having seen whaling ships in the bay at Ascension Island only a few days before. The raider made for the island. Now known as Pohnpei, Ascension Island has long been a stopping point for whalers heading north. Lod Harbor is located in the southeast portion of the island. 4 whaling ships riding at anchor were in sight. The cruiser sailed up to the harbor entrance. A former convict named Thomas Horrock, who had resided on the island for some years, was sent in one of the whalers' boats to guide the ship flying English colors into the harbor. It was April 1st, 1865. The 4 ships were the barks Pearl of New London, Edward Carey of San Francisco, Hector of New Bedford, and Harvest, flying the flag of Hawaii, but originally of New Bedford. 4 boats with prize crews were sent to each of the ships. All first mates were brought off after being captured upon their return from visiting friends ashore. The 4 captains were brought aboard. All were placed in irons, and the Confederates began transferring items from the captured ships subsequent to being condemned in a prize court held aboard the raider. Lieutenant Whittle reported in his journal that Harvest had no bill of sale, a Yankee captain and mates the same as before she was said to have been sold, with the same name. She, with the rest, was condemned as a prize. Over the next several days, the Confederates removed what they wanted from the ships, ran them upon the reefs, and permitted the island population to plunder what remained. When this was completed, the ships were burned. Shenandoah steamed out of the harbor on April 13, 1865. For several weeks, the ship lay in the tracks of the shipping from America to the Orient. As well as experiencing some of the most pleasant weather of their voyage, they also were to battle gales. However, they were to cross the path of not one enemy ship. In frustration, Captain Waddell decided to continue to the whaling grounds, first the Sea of Okhotsk. On May 21st, Whittle reported that they passed through the Amphitrite Strait and entered the Okhotsk Sea. Sailing in seas with floating ice was a new adventure for the southern seamen, and the winter clothing was broken out. On the 27th of May, a sail was sighted and brought to by gun. The captain of the bark Abigail, Ebenezer Nye, never expected to see a Confederate raider in the North Pacific. The prize proved to be a lot of trouble for the cruiser. Nye had a large quantity of alcohol on board, which he would sell to his crew and use in trade with local inhabitants. There were 15 50-gallon barrels of whiskey, 11 barrels of gin, 8 barrels of rum, 1 barrel of pure alcohol, 736 gallons of brandy, 36 dozen bottles of cider, 30 dozen cordial, 12 dozen bitters, 10 dozen schnapps, 1.5 barrels port wine, 40 cases port wine, 1 barrel sherry rum, 10 dozen bottles of malt wine, 10 dozen ginger wine, 24 cases of claret, and 8 bottles of champagne cider. The boarding party found the alcohol and proceeded to celebrate the capture. A second party sent to the whaler was to ascertain why the first party had not returned. When the second party also failed to return, the Marines were dispatched to resolve the situation. Not surprisingly, the Marines decided to handle it by becoming part of the festivities. It took yet another boat from the raider with a contingent of officers to place the sailors and Marines under control. Several days were spent returning the ship to normal. On May 28th, Abigail was burned. With ice being a danger to men unaccustomed to sailing in such seas, and with the unspoken relief of his crew, the captain decided to leave for the hunting grounds in the Bering Sea. On the 13th of June, the raider exited through the Amphitrite Strait and steered a northeast course. Constant fog made navigation difficult, but Whittle recorded their location in the Bering Sea on Saturday, June 17th. On June 22nd, the raider came up with William Thompson and Euphrates. Each hoisted the flag of the United States and was taken. Euphrates was burned immediately. The Confederates took water and provisions from William Thompson before burning her. Milo, valued at $46,000, was captured afternoon. Waddell, now with the crews of 4 prizes on his hands, chose to bond Milo and use her to ship his prisoners to the nearest port. Sophia Thornton was captured while attempting to elude her pursuer in the ice, and Jeriah Swift was overhauled after a chase. The crews of these whalers also were transferred to Milo. The captain of Milo protested that there were too many men to maintain aboard his ship until they reached a port. Captain Waddell instructed the captain of Milo to take what he wished from Sophia Thornton and then burn her. To ensure no attempt would be made to also man the ship, the carpenters from Shenandoah cut down the masts. After receiving some stores from Sophia Thornton, the Confederates parted company with Milo. The whaler brigantine Susan Abigail was taken on the 25th of June while trading for furs with the native population. The brigantine had cleared from the port of San Francisco on April 26th and sailed for the whaling grounds on April 28th. She carried the latest news the crew of Shenandoah would receive since leaving Australia. That headline was Jeff Davis determined to fight it out. On the 25th of June, the raider captured the whale ship General Williams near St. Lawrence Island. On the 26th, Shenandoah came up with 3 more vessels, W.C. Nye, Catherine, and Nimrod. All were burned. Waddell now was contending with more than 200 prisoners. It was determined to place the men in the boats of the ships and bring them along under tow. 4 more sails were in sight, so the raiders set off to capture these prizes with 12 boats stringing along behind. Having information that Benjamin Cummings had smallpox aboard, the Confederates took Isabella, General Pike, and Gypsy. Isabella and Gypsy were burned. Pike was bonded to transport the prisoners already aboard Shenandoah and under tow. On June 28th, the bark Brunswick had stove her bow on the ice, and 10 whalers were in attendance to her when the black steamer came up. The raider burned Brunswick, Congress, Covington, Favorite, Hillman, Isaac Hallen, Martha II, Nassau, and Waverly. Because she was a slow vessel, Nile was bonded. James Maury was bonded because the wife and children of the captain, who had died, were aboard. The remains of the captain were being preserved in a barrel of whiskey for burial back in New England. Both Niall and James Maury were to take prisoners to San Francisco. James Maury landed hers in Hawaii. Upon entering the Arctic Sea and finding ice a problem farther north, Captain Waddell believed the remaining whalers were not safely reachable. He was apprehensive that ships bearing prisoners would soon reach San Francisco, and the enemy would send warships after him. Even if he won a battle in the Bering Sea, there was no port where he could get repairs made. Waddell chose to return to the Pacific. On August 2nd, they encountered another merchant ship. Master's mate Irvin S. Bullock, half-brother of James Dunwoody Bullock, was sent in the boat. The log entry for this day reads, "At 12:30 made a sail bearing northwest, got up steam, furled sail, and at 2 o'clock stood in chase. At 4 came up with and sent a boat alongside of British bark Barracuda from San Francisco to Liverpool 13 days out. At 4:30 hauled fires and hoisted propeller. Made sail, having received from the Barracuda the sad intelligence of the overthrow of the Confederate government. All attempts to destroy the shipping or property of the United States will cease from this date. Accordingly, an order was issued from the commander to strike the battery below and disarm the ship and crew." Waddell decided to return the ship and crew to Liverpool. They steamed 17,000 miles, entered Liverpool harbor, and lowered the last flag of an active Confederate command on November 6, 1865. Shenandoah had been at sea for 12 months and 17 days, sailed in every ocean except the Antarctic, traveled 58,000 miles. She was the only Confederate ship to circumnavigate the globe, captured 37 prizes while losing not one of the 1,053 crewmen of the ships which were captured or destroyed. In Liverpool Harbor, Shenandoah was turned over to Captain James Almer Dorset Painter of HMS Donegal. After several days of deliberation, the government of Great Britain decided to release those of the crew who were not British subjects and who therefore would be guilty of violating the Foreign Enlistment Act. Captain Painter was asked to detain the ones who were likely to be prosecuted. None was detained. The ship was turned over to the American consul in Liverpool, who hired a crew and merchant captain, Thomas F. Freeman, to sail her to America. Departing on the 21st of November at noon, she experienced heavy gales and only reached 25 degrees east longitude on the 1st of December, when she was put about on the 6th with the loss of sails and short of coal. In a memorandum to the State Department, Secretary Wells of the U.S. Navy Department said it would be best if Shenandoah were turned over to the Secretary of the Treasury as abandoned property and let Consul Dudley sell her in Liverpool. On 22 March 1866, Shenandoah was auctioned at the sale room of C.W. Kellogg and Company. Mr. Matthew J. Wilson, merchant and shipowner of Liverpool, was the winning bidder at 15,750 pounds. A few hours later, Wilson sold her to the Sultan of Zanzibar, who had her fitted up as a pleasure yacht. On Monday, April 15, 1872, a violent hurricane hit the island of Zanzibar. The former ship Shenandoah, now renamed El Majidi, was driven on French Island during the blast from the south, and afterwards, when the hurricane came from the north, was lifted up and driven on a reef about 2 miles distant. She was salvaged by second-class carpenter William Shannon and some men from HMS Wolverine between the 4th and 26th of June. Directed to Bombay for repairs, Sea King sank before reaching her destination. 7 of her survivors were picked up off the east coast of Africa by HMS Britain on 20 September 1872. That is the story of the Shenandoah. Any questions? Yes, sir. They appointed about a half dozen men to be Marines. So they had not been mustered at a Marine station at all. Yes, sir.
I read something that suggested
Well, who knows? The only document we have is that Mallory told Waddell when he commissioned her to name her Shenandoah, and that's it. Yes, sir. Well, a prize court was conducted on board ship as it would have been in a port. The captain, of course, was the judge, and he would look over the manifests. They would evaluate what they thought to be the value of the cargo and also the value of the ship. At the same time, they had to decide if it was, in fact, a prize of war. Of our first 7 prizes, 2 of them proved to be neutral ships. So they didn't destroy them. They sent them as prisoner cartels to South American ports. But once they decided that it was in fact a good prize, which meant that it belonged to an owner of the enemy of their country, then it would be destroyed. Well, no, you didn't. You really didn't need it, but everything was documented, and they would have to give that documentation to the government. So they were very careful about doing this the right way. Yeah, probably in England now. Anybody else? Yes, sir. The British government has taken a lot of heat over this 150 years. And I have not found a single piece of evidence that they didn't do anything except follow strictly their laws. They were a neutral, and by international law, a neutral could trade with a belligerent. The U.S. government didn't like the fact that most of the nations of the world had declared neutrality, therefore making the Confederacy a belligerent, and a belligerent is by definition a nation at war. So they refused to recognize that. However, they had a vested interest in not recognizing that. But everybody else considered both sides as legitimate belligerents engaged in war. And the United States was actually responsible for that because they declared a blockade of the southern ports. You cannot blockade a portion of your own country. The only thing you could do is close a port. Well, there are 2 problems with that. One is that any ship that comes into that port in violation of the closed port would have to be adjudicated in a federal court in the city. Well, there were no federal courts in the southern cities at this time. The second thing is that according to the Constitution, Section 1, Article 9, every port must be treated equally. That means that if they had closed Charleston, as an example, they would also have to close Boston and New York and Philadelphia and every other port, or be in violation of the Constitution. But England strictly followed its rules and its laws. Yes, John? Well, the International Commission found that the International Commission was operating under different rules. In 1871, a treaty conference was held in Washington, D.C., and that was between the United States and Britain. And it was decided that that treaty, the provisions of the treaty, would have such things as any ship built that could possibly be used as a warship in a neutral port would have to be seized by the government of that neutral nation. Also, that any ship that used a port of a neutral nation to get seamen, to get provisions, to have repairs, would also not be allowed. Great Britain did accede to that, but they acceded to it, saying at the same time, we do not recognize that we violated any of our laws in the war just ended, but they would allow it to continue using these provisions. And I think they did because now, from being just ahead of the United States as a merchant fleet on the high seas, England was by far the largest. They had just gotten a huge chunk of the American merchant fleet. And they knew that the next time they went to war, if it wasn't with the United States would hang out a big sign. Would you like commerce raiders built here? We'll be glad to build them for you. And really the $15.5 million that England had to pay was a drop in the bucket compared to the loss of those ships if England had to fight a war and fight merchant raiders at the same time. By the way, the tribunal decided that Britain should pay in gold coin, $15.5 million in gold coin. Britain did not pay in gold coin because $15.5 million in gold coin. Now think of the price of an ounce of gold today. $15.5 million would have weighed more than 28.5 tons. So that was a huge amount of money. And the United States was also apprehensive that if that much gold came into the economy all at once, it would cause a tremendously bad inflation. So it was decided that Great Britain would pay off bonds that the United States had in Europe that they'd use to fight the war. And that's how that was settled. That tribunal was the first time that two nations had settled disputes at an arbitration table. The first time.
That's all part of the Alabama claims.
Yes, yeah. They were called the Alabama claims because the Alabama had done the most damage. Yes, sir.
They could build the ships in England, and they're making money from getting the ship built. But then you said they couldn't stock it with sail and cordage or cannons.
No.
They could build a ship, and they had to go somewhere else to get the cannons.
They had to go somewhere else to get the arms and equipment. They got the sails. You could build a ship. The phrase is, can build and not equip or arm a ship, because that means that as soon as it would have left the river, it would be ready to implement war. Therefore, it would have been using London, in this case, as a port to carry on war with the United States. So in every case of the commerce raiders, except the Sumter, which was a Confederate ship that left New Orleans, all of the others were purchased or built in England, and then they left England to meet a supply ship. In the case of Shenandoah, it was Laurel. And then they would transship everything on that ship in a port other than a British port or in British territory. As long as they did that, they were not violating British law. Yes, sir.
How did the entities that financed all these operations fare in terms of ever actually being paid by the Confederate government and gold?
Well, they got their money from Fraser Trenum and Company. After the war, though, Fraser Trenum was taken to court, and they went out of business. There were so many lawsuits that They could no longer continue business.
But did they collect
No,
their payment? They didn't collect their payment.
no.
Were they sympathizers?
Pardon?
Were they just Southern sympathizers?
Well, Fraser Trenum's president was George Trenum, who was the last Secretary of the Treasury of the Confederacy. And that was a Charleston business that had its operation under the name Fraser Trenum and Company in Liverpool. Yes, sir.
For those who maybe weren't here a couple weeks ago, can you describe a couple of the items related to the Shenandoah in the museum's collection?
If you take a look upstairs, the item of the month is a fancy box that was given to a daughter of Matthew Fontaine Maury by a relative of hers named Dabney Minor Scales, who was an officer on the Shenandoah. And that was taken from the Abigail in the Ohosk Sea in May of 1865. We also have, as you saw, the flag that was lowered in Liverpool. That flag has been on display now twice since the museum obtained it. Once in our Navy exhibit between 2005 and 2008, and again 2 Fridays ago. But it is 88 inches tall and 136 inches long. It's huge. But most naval flags are huge. We also have, as you saw, the rail pass, the ticket to get on the Laurel. We have the log of the Shenandoah. We have the journal written by the executive officer. Also, the journal of one of the lieutenants, as well as the chief surgeon on board the ship, and numerous other things. But we have a good Shenandoah collection. Yes, sir.
What was the total number of ships that Shenandoah captured?
37. She bonded 5 of them. October 13th to June 28th. Yes, sir. Let me take you. We have a journal from a fellow on board the Florida, and yeah, the Georgia. Yeah.
Is the Maury you were just talking about, the person that has the statue on Monument Avenue here in Richmond?
That's the person.
Pathfinder of the Seas?
Yep. When they decided to bond a ship, they would take the results of the prize court, which is the value of the cargo and value of the ship, and they would have the master of the ship. Merchant ships captains are not called captain, they're called master. They would have the master of the ship sign, pledge his word that the owner of the ship would pay to the Confederate government that amount of money after the war. Yep, and they went on their way. Well, of course, they were not prisoners of war, just as the Shenandoah did not surrender to the British because they weren't at war with the British. They just lowered the flag. But the crew, the crewmen, not the officers, but the crewmen came from everywhere. Sailors used to be called citizens of the world. And if you could be a sailor, you could go into any port and get on any ship and you'd be off and on your way. The officers, however, were all Confederate officers. That's what makes a ship a commerce raider for a nation. If she had been privately owned, she would have been called a privateer. and would have been operating under a letter of marque. But she was a commerce raider, which meant that she was under the command of officers of that nation's navy. Most of the officers after the war, the United States really was upset with the Confederate Navy because the commerce raiders had destroyed the American merchant fleet. They just destroyed it. They sank more than 200 of them. The insurance rates went sky high, and merchants around the world wouldn't use American ships to ship goods. So the American owners sold them to foreign ownership. They're gone. The United States, just to get off topic a minute, the United States after the war passed a law, or the Congress did, that said no ship that had been sold to foreign ownership could be bought back. And I think they did that because Congress was now in bed with the railroad people. And the railroads were beginning to move west. And they were getting a lot of land, and they were getting a lot of help. And the United States went from being a seafaring nation to being pretty much a land nation. If you'd gone to Boston in the mid-19th century, you would have seen ships all over the place. Read Moby Dick. Read his description of American ports. It was a seafaring nation. But the Civil War ended that. At that time, Hawaii was a seafaring port. They supplied most of the equipment for whalers and many of the seamen for whalers. But what the Shenandoah did to them, from the end of the Civil War to today, Hawaii is a sugar producer. So it had interrupted Hawaii's commerce. Now, what was the other part of your question? All the gray hairs. The crew. Okay. So the United States refused to grant them pardons. And Captain Waddell had to stay in England. His wife was thrown into jail and was not allowed to communicate with him for several months. They finally let her go. Many of the officers went to South America, went to Mexico. Other Confederate Navy officers, one from the Georgia, ended up in Egypt, and he was an admiral in the Egyptian Navy. But the United States, for about 10 years, didn't allow them any access to this country. But they finally did get it. And Waddell came back. He joined the Maryland Oyster Navy. He was in command of the oyster fleet. So he's the only man we know of who served 3 U.S. navies: the U.S. Navy, the Confederate Navy, and the Maryland Oyster Navy. And he ended up getting a job as captain of mail ships traveling back and forth between San Francisco and Australia. And then when he retired to Maryland. That's where he's buried now. No, that was Bullock, James Dunwoody Bullock. And he did not live long enough to see his nephew become president, but he did help him with his book, The Naval War of 1812. He snuck in once because when you're married to the Roosevelts, you can get away with some things. Pardon? No, it was Uncle Jimmy. So he came back at least once, but Teddy Roosevelt went over to visit him in England, and that's where Uncle Jimmy helped him write his book. Anybody else? Okay, thank you.
Okay.